All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Fulcrum Global Podcast, where friends and peers get together to discuss and brainstorm on issues and trends impacting the world of national security, defense, intelligence, and foreign affairs. I'm Sam Kessler, the host of this podcast. And in case you don't know what Fulcrum Global is or does, it's the digital media platform of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at American Military University. You can check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us, and we have a wide range of articles and resources and all sorts of content that we put together and create for our members and people in the community. So let's get started. This is our third podcast episode, and today I'm excited to have our two guests. Our main one is Dr. Hans Mumm, and our second guest is going to be Dan Opstal, who is the faculty advisor for SDSS. And let's just get started with the intro here. First of all, gentlemen, thanks for coming here today. And it's glad to have
Thank you.
Dr. Mumm has 27 years experience in emerging and disruptive technologies, fields, and information technology arenas. He's been a senior intelligence officer, and he's also a cybersecurity professional. After he was in the Army, he went on to lead highly visible, high-pressure projects in autonomous systems research, artificial intelligence, 5G initiatives, cybersecurity, risk management programs for the intelligence community, including the Director of National Security, National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. He is a published researcher and is an author of 7 books, and he's currently working on his 8th. He is also an advocate for the U.S. to adopt integrated autonomous infrastructure that would allow a dynamic cross-sector risk management process through private-public partnerships to transform outdated U.S. infrastructure. He's previously taught at AMU, and he currently teaches Homeland Security courses at California University of Pennsylvania, education and doctorate of management with concentration in Homeland Security from Colorado Technical University, an MS in Strategic Intelligence from American Military University, and a BS in Management from Chadwick University. He is also a recipient of 23 personal military ribbons medals, including 6 military unit medal citations and 2 director awards from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And Dan Opstal is a field grade reserve U.S. Air Force officer, is a faculty advisor on the SDSS Advisory Board, instructor at AMU in the School of Security and Global Studies. And his courses include a combination of international relations, intelligence, cyber warfare, geographic information systems, advanced geospatial intelligence and counterterrorism. And he previously worked at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and currently works at the U.S. Department of the Interior as Executive Secretary in Civil Applications Committee, dealing with remote sensing and geospatial intelligence matters. Dan is a passionate multilingual advocate for collaborative technologies, education and remote sensing, geographic information systems, and support of collective national defense and appropriate civil uses. He has also managed multi-million-dollar geospatial intelligence programs and participated in the creation of Air Force innovations in geospatial visualization. Well, you can see both of them have a very strong technological focus that deal with the infrastructure of the U.S. and a wide range of intelligence capabilities. It's a pleasure to have you both on here.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much.
Well, I hope I covered everything at least all the key points, at least, because it's you guys have very impressive backgrounds. And Dr. Mumm, the first thing I'll start off with is, as an intelligence officer, you mentioned in one of our earlier communications that one of your more famous projects was during Operation Iraqi Freedom as the intelligence officer in charge of Iraqi playing cards with Saddam Hussein as the ace of spades. What does that mean?
So back in 2003, when we were gearing up to head into Iraq, obviously we'd gone through the attacks on 9/11. We were in Afghanistan already. By late 2002, most of the intelligence community knew that we were gearing up for Iraq, and we were going to head into Iraq as well. Well, one of the things that I noticed as this was going along was that nobody really knew who we were looking for. So there was a huge disconnect between Washington, D.C. and the guys on the ground. So folks in Washington, D.C. thought, well, everybody has a high-side computer, don't they? You of course know who we're looking for. We're looking for Saddam Hussein and his regime. Who's his regime? Most folks that went over to Iraq had never, they'd never gone overseas. They hadn't been to the Middle East. They didn't understand any of this. So as things moved along, we were getting ready to actually cross the border and go in. Kept asking the question, well, what are we going to do? So I brought this up to, some of the leadership, and they said, well, you should make a field manual. Now, a field manual is fancy toilet. Okay. So being, I was enlisted first, and then I ended up, the enlisted don't really read those field manuals. So I said, well, how do we do this? How can I train the troops to understand what they're doing there at the same time of not having them look at it as training? So I actually created the deck of cards. We looked at, obviously we had, Saddam's the Ace of Spades. We did that because the Ace of Spades is the most notorious, card in the deck, right? And we purposely did not use the jokers. I used the jokers as actually instructions to the troops. So most of the folks that were over there didn't understand the ranking system, like what's a colonel, what's a corporal? Are they the same? Who knows? They didn't really know. So what I did was I actually gave them instructions on the jokers, because I didn't want problems coming down the road like, well, this is a joke, or these people are a joke, or Saddam's a joke, because Saddam wasn't a joke. He was real. And so what I wanted to do was be able to get them to understand who we were looking for, who the most important, obviously from the ace down, who the most important, and then what did his regime look like? Right now in the US, right, we have line and block charts. I can tell you who the president is all the way down to, SecDef or anybody else. You don't have that in the Middle East. So there was a fundamental misunderstanding, disconnect, because Washington, D.C. was saying, well, there's certain goals that we want out of the Iraq war, right? We want weapons of mass destruction, which wasn't my problem at the time. It became my problem later. We want regime change, and we want to stabilize the region. That's what President Bush said they wanted. Well, in order to create regime change, you have to be able to find the regime and either bring them to justice or understand that they're no longer part of the regime. Well, they don't have driver's licenses over there the way we do. They don't have Social Security. They don't have phone numbers. They don't have addresses the way we do. Their naming convention isn't the same as ours. Their birth dates aren't the same as ours. So literally we had people going into the country saying, what is your name? What is your address? What's your birth date? And we would have people who, I had a young man, he looked at me and he says, birthday? His imam kept his birthday. His imam had that information. He didn't know his birthday. He didn't know it. So what I was trying to do was bring it down to the level of the soldiers so they could understand what they needed to do to be successful in their mission. When it originally was sent out there, it was actually a classified product. It was declassified when General Brooks held it up on Air National TV. And then, it ended up being the most successful information operations campaign in the history of DIA. That's their words, not mine. They put it on the award. So it was very successful. And obviously last many presidents have talked about the cards, President Bush, things like that. And even as the anniversaries come up, it was also a way to sort of dehumanize. So when you listen to the news, Fox News, CNN, World News, they would talk about, well, they found the Ace of Spades, or they found the King of Diamonds. And that was done on purpose, right? We weren't trying to, we in no way were trying for bloodshed just for the sake of bloodshed. right? So there were people who said, oh, this is the deck of death, and that wasn't really what we were doing. We were basically selling a product, which was, we need to know where these guys are, the guys and gals. We need to know where they are, and we just need to know, do they need to be in jail? Are they against us or for us? And are they going to continue with the same old regime that they were with when they were dealing with Saddam, or do they understand it's a new day and they're going to change? So that's really why we did it.
Trying to find all of the right people, making sure that we were in contact, making sure that the allies were coming along. It was all of those pieces going on, and to hear kind of that subset story is so fascinating. Right?
Well, and it was also universal because we had an alliance. So if you were going to do a field manual, you're going to do it in English, right?
Exactly.
That's not going to help your Polish troops. That's not going to help everybody else. And a deck of cards is universal. It was simple. Right. They knew exactly who they were looking for. They knew why, and they knew the ranking order. So it worked out.
No, it's so cool because it's that pictorial, it's that graphical representation, the power of an image, right? I mean, I've got an image behind me of the Red Tails, and that's so iconic, right? So people remember the Red Tails, and what they had to do to just to serve, right? And so I just love the idea of that pictorial representation. So, all right, Sam, over to you.
It's pretty interesting because a lot of people don't realize that the putting together a lot of the information, they don't realize that not everyone operates the way we do here in the US. Like, we're a very open society, and trying to get all that information together, it's a lot of work, but it served a good purpose and it helped achieve the goal. So that's really pretty amazing. When putting all that together, is it like years of effort of all sorts of analytical pieces that people may have put together that contributed to it, or was it like something that was operational based?
So it was a little bit of both. So part of the reason why I was doing it was I was actually working on a database, and this database had about 3,000 personalities in it. And we were updating this database, and it had been around for several years, and they tried to update and keep this information. And what that was able to do was really to cross-reference. So we ended up with one of the first, you heard of maybe analyst notebooks, where you could actually do nodes and network charts. Well, remember, this is back in 2001, 2002, when things weren't as cool as they are today. It took a lot of work to be able to do these nodes and networks. But what we were able to do was to take the nodes and networks and be able to bring everything to the regime or to Saddam. So literally, we were looking at the idea that, hey, Sam, you were in Hawaii at the same time as Saddam Hussein. Do you have a connection to him? Is there a financial connection? Is there a family connection? Is there an international connection? And so that's how we ended up looking at all of these different personalities, figuring out the top 52, right? Figuring out those, but then looking all the way down and going into a black, white, gray list, right? So we were also looking at a white list of, these are people that are pro-American. They want change, they want freedom, they want all of these things. They will help over time, right? They're not going to jump in the middle of a war, and we don't want them to. But we needed them there, afterwards to help the rebuilding efforts. So when you look at this entire project of being able to identify the regime, being able to go after the regime, all of these different things, the purpose behind it really was to get to the end state, and the end state was stability. But we were trying to get to the end state quickly. And the only way that we were going to do that was to be able to move the old regime out, to be able to put other folks in. And that's where being able to have our allies understand what we were doing and everything else. The other thing that it did, which I didn't really understand at the time because I was bouncing back and forth to Iraq and other places, it was actually a rally point for the war here in the US. Even now, people will find out who I am, and I've had car dealerships in the Midwest stop and talk to me, and they said, you don't understand, like, you don't realize what you did. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, we actually took our banners down. So they had the big, huge signs out in front of the car dealership. They actually took those down, and they made a deck of cards all the way across it. And every time we got one, they would put an X over it, and they would say, we got another one. It was actually a rally point for the nation, for the war, to be able to keep them on our side, because we had a challenge. The last time we were in Iraq, it was a 96-hour war.
Mhm.
This was going to be a 10-year war. This was going to be a 10-year effort. And it's turned into almost 20-year effort on and off, right? But it was a rally point for the war. It was a rally point for the administration to be able to say, we got the Queen of Spades today. We got whatever. So they could show progress to the American people. Because when you say, well, we got Chemical Ali, what does that mean to somebody? It means nothing to them. If you can show the card with the suit and why they're important, because now I understand, well, wait a minute, Chemical Ali was higher up in the deck than a two of diamonds, right? So that was an important guy. So we got an important guy who's now giving us information. So it was actually a rally point for the nation as well.
That makes a lot of sense, because you definitely need to have people understanding and getting an idea that, okay, we got this person, we got that, it means this. People like to piece together all the details and get an idea. This is why this is happening. This is the benefits, and it's really good. It's important, because if you get people involved, or at least aware, you get public support, and it really supports the operation too in the long term.
And when you look at it, you end up also being able to collect a lot of different intelligence as things move forward. So like Dan was working with the geospatial. Now you could graphically show where these people are.
That's right. That there's a lot of fascinating linkages that you can show by spatially referencing any kind of information, right? I mean, it could be, who knows who down the street, but for these purposes, increasingly you see objects being referenced to events, times, timelines, engagements, right? And there's a lot of power to that, right? And so when you pictorially represent them, the top of those elements, and you categorize the information that way in a relatable way, right? That's the key thing. Showing a big, giant splash spaghetti chart of networks and events and timelines and bad actors and good actors, all of that is very nice to someone that tracks that kind of thing, right? And sits and is paid to analyze. To someone who's just out there, they're not going to be interested in that. The car dealer in the Midwest, to Hans's point, not interested, right? But when you relate it to a key person, when you relate it to pictorial reference point, right, and to then all of a sudden, now everyone understands the deck of cards. Now I've related that deck of cards to these key players, right, and then it's the amalgamation of the information. Now all of a sudden you've got something that has taken something that can be very abstract, right? Bad actors moving around on timelines, geospatially referenced, understandable to people, sure, but not necessarily of interest to them. You've now made it relatable and interesting in a pictorial format. And I think that's the beauty of some of Hans's work there.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a version of mind mapping, in a sense, where you're trying to put all the key things together and tying it all like that, but with deck cards. So that was roughly 2 decades ago. Do you think the same process could still be used today, or do you have to use more modern or sophisticated approaches? Like, do you think that type of thing is still utilized, or do they have to change it with the way everything is with social media, open source, and all that?
I think that you could still do a version. It would just be a little bit different. Keep in mind that they did attempt a version in Afghanistan. It fell flat on their face with it. The sad part is that nobody even reached out to my team to ask them, hey, why are you so successful? How did you end up doing this? It wasn't that we just threw a bunch of people onto a deck of cards. I mean, there was actually strategy behind what we were doing. There was a thought process behind it. And what happens when, what happens if, right? So there's other folks who did try, but they never even talked to the team that was successful, which was really kind of sad because in Afghanistan, they had attempted matchbooks, they've attempted flyers, they've attempted decks of cards, they've attempted crazy stuff like $5 million rewards. There's folks around the world, you and me, who were like, wait a minute, if Osama bin Laden had a $20 million bounty on his head, why didn't somebody turn him in? Well, same reason why I started the conversation with. There's a huge disconnect between the glass houses in Washington, D.C. and the reality on the ground. When you go to an average person in Afghanistan and say, I'll give you $20 million, what you just said was la, 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 la. It meant absolutely nothing. So they attempted many things in Afghanistan that didn't work. Now, can a deck of cards work again someday? Probably. But I think, again, you have to have a strategy behind it, a reasoning behind it, and why are you doing it? Keep in mind that, I think if you were going to do something like this, you'd have to do it more as like a solitaire game, because, that's what everybody understands on computers, right? How to play solitaire. A lot of people don't play blackjack or poker anymore. So I think you could do it, but I think it would be a little bit more difficult with the generational changes. And then what's your target audience? If you're looking at, younger generations, I think the challenge with your social media is what's the truth? Am I really honestly looking for the ace of spades, or is that what they're telling me? I think that, we have a different world now, and a world of disinformation versus information, which is really going to hurt, how we move forward in the intelligence business. Our job is without passion to, find the facts and present them to the senior leaders. We're not political. We're not supposed to be. And so I think that it would change drastically and dynamically if anybody ever wanted to try to do another deck.
When you're looking at the differences in generations, do you think it's important to at least make sure your people working have knowledge, both the digital, but also the analog side of thinking? Does that give an extra edge when it comes to that? Or, do you think it should be just more because like everything is digitalized, but there's a lot of threats out there that could just take a lot of stuff out. So, how do you get people to be able to adapt to if they have to deal with an analog environment?
Well, I think you've got, you have a challenge just even getting them to adapt to a full digital environment. Our government has been trying to digitize everything from the, Department of Motor Vehicles on up, right? But what they do is they end up digitizing poor processes. So, in certain areas, it's called speeding up stupid. We didn't really fix the process, right? There's a frustration sitting down at DMV waiting to register your car, and there's a frustration of what paperwork I'm supposed to have and everything else. So we threw it into the digital environment, and we didn't really fix the processes. We didn't fix the problem. So I think teaching both ends, it is important, but I think the process and the actual getting people to think is the more difficult. And that's where, again, when you're looking at the social media aspects of where things are going, are we actually helping them or hurting them by doing certain things? Now, I can tell you, in the analog world, since I write books, I hope you don't go all digital, because I think my books are more exciting, turning a page than, sitting on Amazon on a Kindle. But I think that, you have to look at where these different worlds are going. When you start into the autonomous world, you're not going to have the luxury of understanding all of the tactile environment around you. Sometimes that machine is going to make decisions that you may or may not like. And so I think that, we have to teach both. but I think we really need critical thinking skills more. So, in that environment. So, is that what you're seeing in your studies as well, Dan?
Yeah, this is a great topic. I mean, when the pre-conversation, we talked a little bit about how everyone approaches situations with their own biases, right? And how the aspect, and I'm sure you'll get into more of this. The coding is influenced by the bias that people have, right? Many times very smart people. I would add to this conversation demographics, right? So understanding who's in the workplace now at various levels applies to every organization you can think of that you work with. And there's a pretty good author, Hayden Shaw, wrote a book called Sticking Points. And it goes into like all these 12 factors of like these issues associated with demographics and how you can start to be more relatable in these issues. And I think if we're going to solve some of these really challenging problems, like autonomous, like unmanned aerial systems, and what we're going to do about them, we're going to have to work together in different groups, understanding those age groupings and appreciating the gifts that they have, and appreciating kind of the things that are counterproductive. But understanding be hard to even get to that point of critical thinking, which is also essential, right? It's about asking questions, and it's about being willing to think through a problem using maybe sometimes a structured analytic thought process, right? It happens in business all the time that you think through a problem set and you analyze, right? And that's what SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, right? Just a classic case study of looking at a problem set through a lens and making sure that I capture issues associated with a particular problem set so that I can be better in the future, and being willing to, as a group, work on that problem set. If we can't get to kind of a collective understanding, it's that much harder than to get into that truth, right? That truth space, that you have a shared truth. And I think that's one of the problems that Hans was pointing out too. Like misinformation and disinformation is rampant now, right? It's been, to use a little bit of a trite term, it's been weaponized, unfortunately, very effectively. And we've got to work together to solve those problems.
So I think also when you start to look at these different issues, you need to look at the global view of what does an individual citizen understand and do. So I'll give you an example with the Austin Police Department is now putting in a drone department. So they're trying to explain to people why they're doing it, what they're doing, what the drone actually will do, can and can't do, all of these different things. So they can use technology for what it's there for, but not scare people for the sake of scaring them. This has been a real issue with all governments, not just the US, looking at the idea of laws, policies, governance, and leadership. All of them are behind. So when we look at, in San Francisco, they put a small robot out to try to help with law enforcement, right? They had a bad crime area, so they put this robot out there. And they put a little sign out that said that the robot was filming, was recording for your safety. Well, do I really believe that? I don't believe that at all, number one. Number two is nobody actually explained to people what they were doing, why they were doing it, what this robot was or wasn't going to do. So if I opened my door and this robot that literally was almost 5 feet high, it was like a cone shape, and this thing's winking and blinking, I don't know what the heck it's going to do. Is it going to shoot me with a laser? I have no idea what it's going to do. Well, that was about $1.5 million failure. So what happened was the citizens revolted and destroyed the robot, literally smeared feces on its sensors, and the police had to go in and rescue the robot. This is where communication, regardless of whether we look at the idea of, millennials or anything else, we have to learn to communicate up and down the scale. Human communication is still one of the most difficult things we do on this planet. I mean, people talk about, quantum computing. Well, we can talk quantum computing if you want, but guess what? If I can't communicate it to you, it really doesn't matter what it is. And that's really where we're struggling right now. in autonomous systems, autonomous infrastructure, and then looking at our student body as to what we're teaching our student body, and are they advanced enough to join the workplace and make a difference, or are we holding them back with some of the older biases of, okay, well, in order to go to college, you absolutely need a physical education, credits. Okay, is that really true, or should we be advancing where we're going? So it's not not that we'll solve it here, but it is some of the challenges that are happening, and worldwide, laws, policies, governance, and leadership are not keeping up with technology, and they definitely are not keeping up with human communication.
No, I love that point, and the importance of the STEM science, technology, education, mathematics, right? It continues to be something that has to permeate throughout a diverse population, right? That's got to be, we got to get past any kind of, hey, this is a certain dominated field by this kind of person or this kind of age group. We're way past that. It's got to be everyone, right? There's now a literacy requirement, a digital literacy requirement. Back to your original question, that requires currency and refueling. I mean, it requires constant refueling. It requires engagement, to be a digital citizen or a citizen of a digital world, right? And I think that's what we're getting at there. And I'll also add that, like, the popular conception of autonomous and RPA too is very scary, right? I mean, if you read, years ago you had Terminator, right? Oh, not that many years ago, I suppose, but you had the artificial robot, right? You had RoboCop, right? You had those things, and even currently, right? I mean, if you read some of the current literature that was put out there, the great story that P.W. Singer tells in Ghost Fleet, right, which is all about this kind of like, basically the supply chain is hacked, right, and all kinds of things are put in supply chain, and then chips are hijacked, right? So nothing works, right? Nothing works anymore, and everything turns against the original user, without giving away too much of that fantastic story. But that's really scary, right? And getting past that kind of convention of this is a scary new thing that's gonna come get me, right? As opposed to, these are cooperative technologies that harness the power of humanity and move us forward, right? But there's almost a little bit of an uphill battle there to deal with a little bit of popular culture of autonomous UAS and other things. Even when there are great stories to be told, right? The success story of Predator, the success story of Global Hawk, those types of things. Even the success story of long dwell, solar powered unmanned aerial systems, which you're seeing now, right? These things have great implications for humanity. But unfortunately, the story narrative sometimes gets a little disjointed.
Well, it's definitely sounds like it's a combination, what you're saying in regards to the communication, the policy, and maybe just the level of speed too, would you say? Or because of, it does act, it's very quick in terms of how things function. And, it goes back to the critical thinking side, I would imagine, because people have to make decisions here at a certain level. You have to weigh a lot of things. I mean, for instance, right now I keep seeing indications. I've been seeing it for at least the past year or so, about in regards to like the pending chip shortages they kept saying, and how it's impacting industries, whether it's automobiles or other areas. Do you think that's going to impact the auto management in terms of autonomous vehicles and all the systems you talk about? Do you think that's an issue?
So I think that it has a possibility, but there is a lot of robotics that are going on overseas. The U.S. sadly is far behind when it comes to autonomous systems. There is a full automated robot called Pepper, which is a humanoid robot. They've got about 2,000 of them out there in industry, and they go up and meet and greet customers. Right? They give information and everything else, and they're fully articulate. There's a bunch of different robots that are out there when you look at that, and I think that the autonomous field they may slow, but it's slightly different chips than what the automobile industry is dealing with. Now, when you look at how do we solve, how do we deal with it? Hyundai Motor Corporation, Hyundai bought Boston Dynamics, right? So there was a lot of money put into Boston Dynamics, through the U.S. government, and then it was sold to Hyundai. And Hyundai basically said, you know what? This chip problem isn't going to get solved. So we're going to solve it. And they're making their own chips now. So, if you want to look at a car, in a year or two, that's going to be probably cheaper and possibly better, look at Hyundai Motor Corporation, because they're solving the problem. Toyota is right behind them. Both Hyundai and Toyota have very, very robust autonomous systems platforms and research. As a matter of fact, Hyundai is working on several different things, from platooning large trucks together so they can move logistics to it. There's companies that have different vehicles that are out there. One of them is actually a vehicle that takes off as a quad rotor, and it basically has a parent-child relationship. And the parent is the quadcopter, but the child is actually a ground vehicle. And so it drops the ground vehicle off so it can go and do whatever it needs to do. So there's a lot of autonomous stuff that's going on in the world. There are certain American companies that are giving it a shot. Ford Motor Company actually has a humanoid robot that they're trying to pair together with one of their unmanned vans to be able to do deliveries. But if we look at what technology can do to help this pandemic, look at Uber. Uber was working on autonomous vehicles. If they were allowed to move a little bit quicker, hopefully with an autonomous infrastructure, so it could understand where it is in time and space, because that's really one of the problems that we have, is that we're relying far too much on GPS, and that's not going to get us where we need to go when we're talking about inches with an autonomous system. But if Uber was allowed to do certain things, you could literally take an Uber taxi and you would get dropped off. The taxi would basically just put up screens on the windows, and it could turn on a blue light at high at a high reflective, and it could literally sanitize the taxi, put them back down, and go to the next. Now, as a customer, I'm in no danger now. So technology can be used for a lot of really, really good things, including crazy pandemics.
No, I love it. And I've always think about these things, studying the movement, the spatial aspect of something, right? These autonomous vehicles, right? The driving piece. I think it's almost like comical now, right? You see commercials on the TV sometimes. They go, oh, your car is essentially a driving computer, right? There's so many sensors on there. But the beauty of that is that it now makes it that much easier. Case in point are all these light detection and ranging, called LiDAR sensors, that allow you, right, to get information back past to the human, right? So there's that augmentation stuff that's permeated the industry. It's like the backup camera in a car, right? You're not going to drive a car anymore most of the time, right? If you buy a modern car that doesn't have a backup camera, it's just an idea whose time had come and made too much sense. But coupled with that are all of those sensors that most people don't even realize they're there, that are giving that light detection and ranging piece. Now, there is a concern, right, of course, and I can't speak fully to this. I'm not a supply chain expert, but yeah, if you're dealing with transistors and those kind of chips and things like that, you could have an issue with disruptions depending on where those are made and who's making them and things like that. But the point is, we've kind of entered this era of this augmented era, right? Already that we're not even having any trouble absorbing it. Cars they beep at you when you change the lane, right? They beep at you, or they adjust speed, or they even brake and stop for you. That's here now, right? And the beauty of all of that all comes out of that technology. It's not that much further a step in some instance from a technology perspective to have the driverless vehicle. Now you get into insurance and you get into all of the other aspects of human life. There are huge leaps and bounds, to say nothing of actual legislation. These are huge leaps and bounds that are different, right? And they're different globally, right? In terms of how we deal with those aspects. But there's a lot of power, and the geospatial power is tremendous. That the situational awareness that these vehicles have now on the ground is just it's a huge leap forward.
Yeah,
I think if you,
sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say the augmented piece that Dan was talking about. There's a couple of different challenges you have. Is one, trying to get people to understand what that augment can do and maybe shouldn't do. When we look at legislation, when we look at laws, when we look at rules, I have a friend who has a very fancy Subaru, and it has adaptive cruise. It has all kinds of adaptive things. And literally he can let his hands off the wheel and it makes adjustments and everything else. Okay, well, when you're living in the Washington, D.C. area, you deal with bumper to bumper traffic 24/7. So he was leaving D.C. about 11 o'clock, leaving out of Georgetown, gets on 95. There is a parking lot on 95, literally for 20 some odd miles, because they decided to do construction and bring 95 down to one lane. So he was tired. He set his adaptive cruise and went to sleep. Now, was that what the technology was really meant for? No, but you never know what the consumer is going to do with these technologies. So you better be ready for what it's going to do, because he said, I knew I shouldn't have done it. He said, but I was literally too tired to drive. He said, I woke up 20 minutes later. I was only 3 miles difference. And he was perfectly fine. It kept him right in the lane and right where he's supposed to be in time and space. So sometimes we have to watch what these things are going to do and really sort of, how much are we letting this augment and go towards full autonomy. The other challenge is generations. So I know some folks who purchased a vehicle and it has all the bells, whistles, and toys on it. And they're driving the vehicle down the road, and all of a sudden it says brake, 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 and then they freak out because they're like, what are you talking about? I'm nowhere close to anything.
Yeah.
Well, that augmented system was just trying to give you a warning, but they didn't understand what that warning was. Because when we say warning, to us, it's, okay, yeah, I'll turn the microwave off. The generations, past generations, when you use the word warning, that's like a bad thing, like bad things are about to happen. So again, we're back to that human communication. How much do we augment this world and try to communicate when we're communicating on our level and not the entire spectrum's level of where things are going?
How do you find that type of a medium? If you're an Air Force and you are using automative planes rather than pilots, or if you have pilots but you have everything on auto, do you just train the drivers to know everything? Do you literally have to change the way they do driver's education courses in the future? Is that the approach? Or do you have to standardize this stuff when you get to that point?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of standardization that's necessary, and yeah, the training protocols do change, right? It doesn't mean that you will always do that thing, and it certainly doesn't mean you may do that thing in a scenario like combat where you're going to have problems, or you might not do that thing in a certain kind of weather scenario, right? So from an aviation perspective, sure, yeah, we can let the autopilot on, but just like Hans's example of the driver being asleep, going fully to sleep. Yeah, that's not the intent of the device. And similarly, I submit to you, if the sensor ball operator on an unmanned aerial system, military unmanned aerial system, and the aviator went to sleep, they'd be in for a world of hurt. Yeah, sure, there'd be an automated system. Maybe it'll even land the platform for you, but they certainly wouldn't be accomplishing their mission. And if they were missing opportunities there, that there's a lot of hurt for them in a disciplinary sense, right? So from that perspective, yeah, there's a point to which you want to make sure that you change your standard operating procedures in a manner that accomplishes your mission, but doesn't let you forget that you still need certain core abilities. An aviator still needs to know how to fly. There was a story told, about, If you're in the Navy now, everything's automated with GPS. You don't need to be able to read star charts anymore or understand what a sextant is, right? I submit to you that those are excellent reasons to study both of those things, especially in a current modern warfare environment where those capabilities, GPS and other systems like it, we hope they're there, right? We hope the scenario that is in Ghost Fleet, for example, and it's not unusual to look at these scenarios. That would be, a real problem for your navigation. If you're so dependent on the platform taking care of you and the augmentation taking care of you constantly that you can't find your way without it, we've obviously gone too far.
But I think this gets back to, bias and standards, right? So when we look at, our bias might be that, we would like our autonomous systems to do, what we consider good. Other people may want those autonomous systems to make decisions, and including kill decisions, that we may not. And that's where right now there is a bias with technology, because there are countries out there who are pushing the envelope for what that means for these different technologies, and what they're teaching their folks, whether it's ethics or whether it's just being able to augment what they're doing with these unmanned systems. And then we have so we've got a bias there, and then we have to look at what is the standard, and who's following it. Because just because we have a standard, or just because we have written policies, doesn't always mean a whole lot.
There's a Star Trek original series episode that kind of makes me think about that when you're talking about kill switches or making the decisions. And there was a original series episode where they're on a planet, and the planet had warring sides, and they had gotten into so much destruction and killing that they decided they would let the computer make the decisions. And eventually the computer did not make the decisions that from a human perspective made sense, because they were I think I'm trying to remember, they were chosen to, like, Kirk and his crew, they were chosen to be the next casualties or something along those lines. But anyway, they found a way to reverse that and to help look at resolving their conflict eventually. But the concept of trying to figure out the kill switch based on ethics and critical thinking, I guess in the 22nd or 23rd century, or whatever century it was, it's even hard then, I suppose. But how do we go forward with, like, if we have to make such decisions, whether rely on it, with critical thinking, how do you apply that to the technologies we have, whether it's with AI or 5G? We have a lot of cybersecurity risks, and we have to make sure we have systems that are protected so that we can make better decisions on the systems we rely on. So I guess I'm trying to figure out a question with all of that.
Well, so I think I can answer in a couple of different ways. So when you're looking at certain questions of AI and how to study, how to program, how to use, remember that we've got Elon Musk is working on Neuralink, where he's actually putting sensors into your brain. And so at that point, that's going to be interesting. But we also have companies here in the US who are chipping their employees. Chipping is very normal in Europe and Eastern Europe. It's not abnormal to be chipped these days. And you do have some companies here. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean for the person? Does that enhance learning? I don't know. I mean, Elon Musk claims that Neuralink will enhance learning, but learning what and learning how? And does that have ethics in it and a bias? And which way does that bias lean? Because it will have bias in it. Anything that's programmed has a bias in it. So I think when we look at that piece of it, it will be difficult to see how we actually train the next generation I don't think it's going to be the old idea of read and regurgitate. At least I hope it's not. I hope we get past that. But I think if you look at cybersecurity, when you're looking at things like 5G, 5G is a radical separation from where we are today with central computing and the movement of information. So when you start talking 5G, now you're starting to talk about computing on the edge. You're starting to talk about speeds that we don't really even understand what it's going to do and all of that. When we have that, what does that mean? Well, that means that literally all of our cybersecurity is broken, because all of our policies, everything that we do is based on a central compute. It's based on either cloud or a central compute. Well, now if I'm computing on the edge, how am I trying to protect the edge as well as the central, as well as the movement, as well as everything else? Our policies aren't built for that. And so now we're going to go back to the drawing board. NIST is working on some of it, and they're doing a pretty good job of trying to move forward with it. But when you look at artificial intelligence or even 5G, how many people have the ability to spend time, usually their own free time, spend time and energy and resources to be able to help write these things? Well, if you go to NIST, they're going to ask you to go onto a panel or help them write these things, but that's free. That's free to them. You normally don't get paid for that work. So you have an immediate bias as to who's actually writing those things. So it becomes a little bit more of a difficult situation and a difficult question than what people may lead on. So are you seeing the same thing, Dan?
So some of my thoughts are related to the encryption, the protection of data, right? That's a huge part of this. And with quantum technologies, this kind of thing becomes very different, right, from the infrastructure that exists right now. And that's kind of the scary frontier, really. And I don't think it's been fully explored yet. I think most people get a little intimidated by even the word quantum. Wasn't that a James Bond movie?
Yes,
it was.
James
Bond. But yeah, but it's not something that they've looked at or thought about. But I think increasingly we see out what the results are of an infrastructure that is not properly protected. Right, the Colonial Pipeline recently occurred. Really, if you wrap your mind around that, like that's a real problem, right? If our infrastructure can be attacked in such a manner that we're now no longer able to maintain control, and it causes, in a relatively specific area, it can be targeted, right, and cause this massive effect, right? These massive second, third, and fourth order effects. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of, right? And those are the kinds of technologies we need to be able to adapt to. And 5G allows the transfer of so much more information than ever before, right? Which allows more complex data to be pooled and collated in a cloud architecture. And cloud is great, right? Because you've got this wonderful diffuse architecture, right? No longer gone are the days of like, hey, my computer blew up, so my stuff is gone, right? Or it used to be, oh, I lost my paper. And we went to, well, I got my computer. Oh, my computer, froze or is hacked. It's gone now. No, we got Dropbox or whatever, something in the cloud. But if someone has access then to that larger treasure trove of information, now all of a sudden it's not a couple papers and maybe a video game on one hard desktop somewhere. You've now lost access to possibly thousands of documents and things of that nature in this cloud architecture. So security in cloud architecture is another huge aspect of this. So I would say, just to wrap up, encryption, 5G information transfer, and cloud architecture. These are all things that we have to wrap our minds around, and people are. But I think back to the original point, right, that Dr. Mumm was making earlier as well, the legislative piece, right? The Computer Security Act, or I think we need a Cloud Security Act, perhaps at this point. I'm not sure anymore. Again, not my exact field, but when it comes back to strategy and defense matters, we got to think about this stuff. Other countries are thinking about how they'll secure that infrastructure and how they'll keep it safe. Finding the right kind of balance is crucial.
Well, how do you put together legislation like that? Because it seems like you're dealing with a lot of special interests, but you also have to have people from, you know, from the industry to work on it and with the emphasis on that. So it seems like you really have to get a lot of people who actually deal with it on a regular basis, putting it all together. Would that be correct? Or, I
It's going
mean,
to be a huge group of folks. Hans, why don't you take a, you've got
Yeah.
a good
So,
on this.
well, so you've got a bunch of different folks, in here, but one of the challenges that we have in America is that we don't necessarily teach cyber hygiene or force it, right? So if you go to other countries, the idea of having antivirus on your computer is more of a law, like it's more of legislated. It's more of like, are you kidding me? You don't have this. Where if you go and buy a computer today, nothing says that you need it. So it can be easily hacked, it can be easily taken over, everything else. So when you look at that, and then part of this is it's our education, and we stop educating ourselves a lot of times in America. Once we finish school, that's it. We're done. We're not the continuing education doesn't seem to stick very well with a lot of folks. So if you think about what Dan was saying with quantum. We had an entire generation that was frustrated in trying to figure out how to set their clock on their VCR. Now, the same generation is still here. A lot of them are actually in leadership positions. And now I'm going to try to explain quantum qubits. I'm going to try to explain quantum teleportation. I'm going to try to explain the multiverse to somebody who is struggling to set a clock on a VCR. And I think that, this is one of those things where we have to be aware of, who our legislatures and other folks are, keeping in mind that there are still a number of people up on Capitol Hill who do not use computers, who do not understand any of this, which becomes very difficult then to get legislation through. And then you have to look and say, okay, if we pass legislation, right, bad guys are always going to change, right? It doesn't really matter. So how do we try to stay ahead? How do we get to the point where, we deal with 0 days? How do we deal with that? And keep in mind, it hasn't been that long that we started putting hackers in jail, but we really don't have that much robust law, especially international, because again, if you go and try to pass legislation, you can pass it for this country, but the internet doesn't reside mostly in this country. It actually resides overseas. This country is actually a small portion of the internet, or a small portion of that data set that is out there. So when you start to look at artificial intelligence and you start to look at the idea of, how do I program that system? Where's my training data coming from? Well, an AI system, I'm not going to waste my time banging on your front door anymore. I'm not. It's too costly to me. So all I'm going to do is find out who's doing your training data. I'm going to write a couple lines of code in that. And when it's all said and done, you're going to get the wrong answer and you're going to do what I wanted anyway. So legislation is good, but being able to educate the whole entire populace as to what's going on, and then basic cyber hygiene. Again, when your password is password, we're in trouble.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just point back to one of the books you wrote was on drone airspace integration, right? So, I mean, how do we get to the point of drone airspace integration if we can't do kind of those basic or those more basic things? And this is not to say that everyone falls in one category. Sure, advances have been made, right? Clearly, people are much more aware. Cloud computing, all of these mobile phones. Obviously, everyone's got a smart computer or more technology than the entire Apollo mission in their hand every day, right? That's trite now, but for example, with getting back to autonomous and unmanned, right? How do we even do that, right? Just quick commentary.
So that you've got companies like Domino's, they're delivering pizzas now with autonomous systems. So how long is it going to be before they start flying? Well, they've already sort of asked that question. Well, we have a little bit of a disconnect, right? So if the ground vehicle is talking to the air vehicle, who's in charge? Well, the flying piece in this is going to say, well, of course I'm in charge, I'm the most dangerous piece, but the ground vehicle is, can be in charge just as much. So this is why, I had written a couple of papers on the need for an autonomous infrastructure. We need to be able to get, to understand time and space. And some of this stuff doesn't have to be multi-billion-dollar programs. So a lot of these new cars, they have basically radars on the front of them. So put a radar reflecting a reflector, it cost about $1 each. Put one on the side of the highway so it can talk. And now it has a feedback loop. Because GPS isn't always going to be there. There's issues with certain GPS, and other countries, they have some pretty good GPS as well. One of my drones that I use for experimentation, I'm actually working on a system right now where I can fly over your building and inject malware into your system. It's just a lot of fun. So, but one of the things that I found out is that I need to be able to beam ride in. So I'm looking for certain things. And I need to be able to lock on and be able to stay with a very small airspace in time and space. And I couldn't do it with the American GPS. Just couldn't get a good enough signal. And now I can sit rock solid. I have no GPS drift. And so now I'm working on the next portion of the payload. So when you look at these things, we need to be able to look and have the entirety of the population understand what all of this stuff is. And we are not doing a very good job with some of that.
Well, that's a fascinating example.
Well, that's really interesting. What, and this will probably be the last question here, or the last point, I guess, to talk about but you look at it from a big picture perspective, and you look how other countries are doing this, and you look at the current state in terms of tensions with other nations. How does the U.S. stay abreast of all this while dealing with all of that? And if other countries have their programs that are implementing a lot of similar stuff, how do you adapt your process to, while you evolve, but you're still secure it? How do you really handle that aspect when you're developing all of this neat technology, but it's, you're still doing it while you're dealing with stuff going on outside of the country? How do you really handle that? Because do people in Washington realize that?
I think a big part of this is maintaining a culture of innovation and open-mindedness towards new ideas. And the example I point to is one that I got several years ago in my current work in innovation issues. We heard about the start of a program, and it involved somebody on leave, military person on leave, frustrated with the mission overseas, went over to one of the innovation elements of the Air Force and said, look what I put together. This is my idea. This system can work if I use these Best Buy components and I link it with this pseudo unmanned system. And if you shape all these things together, why can't I have this downrange? And, in some cases, if that's what happens to your innovation director, there are entities that would have been like, who are you and what are you doing? But fortunately, there was a culture of innovation in that particular unit that said, wow, we've got a problem that's been identified for us. And not only that, we've got a smart individual who's a user downrange who understands and is aware and is making life or death decisions. And guess what? They've presented us with at least the beginnings of solution. We have an obligation to take this forward, fix this. And it actually, that particular example that I'm generalizing, became a very successful program. And it's used to this date to provide over the horizon, basically a perspective or video perspective on situations where a person cannot see over the next hill or over the next horizon, right? So those kinds of technologies and the willingness to adopt them quickly. And then there's many scenarios and there's many ways that kind of scenario could play out.
The things that are going on overseas and how fast technology is being adopted. Toyota does home robots, Samsung does home robots. We have a situation where we're scared of a Roomba, a vacuum, right? I think that it tells a whole different story in the US when we look at the Internet of Things. What does that mean? How do we use them? How do we secure them, or do we? And so I think when we're looking at this, I think we have to keep not only an open mind, but I think we have to have cross-border collaboration. We have some, but I think that we're also a little jaded sometimes, when we look at the science community. Well, China's doing this, so we can't do that, or somebody's doing this. And I think that when we look at the world, how small the world is now, I think we have to start to move forward with some of this, because the world standard for a home robot hasn't been created. The world standard for integration of autonomous systems or AI systems or quantum, we're talking about, quantum repeaters are now coming online, and they're talking about quantum repeaters in space. We haven't even figured these things out yet. And again, we're back to still trying to set the clock on the VCR. And I think that at some point, the US is going to have to sort of give up the idea that we're going to stay in the past and the rest of the world will move forward and then we'll catch up, because that's really where we're at. The world moves forward and then we try to play catch up. And then we say, well, we're the US, we'll just throw money at it. Money isn't going to mean anything when you're talking in the quantum realm and AI realm. And then, of course, it really doesn't mean anything in the autonomous systems realm. But when we're starting to talk about blockchain, about how the banking systems are changing, you've got nations that are now taking on crypto as their main currency. Mm-hmm. And we're still arguing over whether cryptocurrency is real or whether it's legal. People are moving on, and we have a great risk that if we don't start to adapt and adopt a lot faster, that we're not going to make it. We're going to have a lot of hard problems when you start looking at, where the augmented realities are, where exoskeletons. I can buy an exoskeleton online for $3,000 and hook it up to myself. I mean, I can do all kinds of crazy things these days very cheaply. And so, are those technologies going to be used for good or evil? Well, that's leadership's issue to figure out. And leadership is struggling with that. There's people, everybody who's sitting on this podcast, right? We're all sticking our hand up saying, you tell me what you need and I'll help you. The challenge is that you don't see leadership reaching out for that help as much as they should.
I agree with that, because the leadership, and like you said, with ethics and critical thinking and tying it all together, it's going to be more important, I think, going forward with that. And like going back to blockchain, I remember that reading stuff about tokenization, how everything from real estate to investments and health and everything is going to could be tied towards the tokens aspect of blockchain. And I always have to revisit that just to remind myself how that works. But it's interesting how they tie it all together and putting people framework, like you said, the people who are stuck with programming the VCR crowd. That's going to be another thing they have to really learn about and try to apply it to how they function or make decisions. So, wow. Well, any other last feedback before we sign off? Or
Dan?
Oh, thanks. No, I just appreciated the opportunity to have this conversation today. I think we covered a lot of ground. There's a lot to explore and unpack in each of the things. And I think the biggest thing to take with you is just to keep that open mind, especially as the technology evolves, and be willing to evolve with it, and to be willing to kind of pass that solution onward, kind of like the example I just gave. When there's an opportunity to pass that information forward to a receptive audience and be creative.
Well, and I want to say thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate Dan as a cohort here, helping me stay on topic. And I appreciate you, Sam, giving some good questions. My last thought is that, again, this is going to come down to leadership. Leadership is a word that has been tossed around for many, many decades and centuries, right? And what does it mean? Is a leader born, or can they be built? But the leadership right now, we really have to start to look at where we're going, to make sure that we understand what our workforce is supposed to be doing, right? Are they supposed to be thinking, or are they supposed to be working? Well, I've got robots that can do construction work. So does that mean that we don't have construction workers anymore? No, that means that I have other people that can think about how that robot can make more houses easier or more efficient, right? So I think we have to look at that piece. And then I think that somewhat we need to back out of some of the old thinking processes. The U.S. government, I was in the Army for many years. And, the very first thing when you do anything in the Army is you get a form, and it has your name, rank, everything else. The folks coming up today, they don't understand why. You already have all that information. If Google can figure out, a form and it's a pre-populate form, why can't you hand me a pre-populate form? And I think that, even the U.S. government is struggling trying to keep people, because their workforce is hearing that, we're innovative, we're future thinking, and then they get there and they fill out these forms after forms after forms with name. It just doesn't, this is one of those things when two things don't connect, people start to shrug their shoulders and say, I'm not believing you at all, and I might go someplace else. And I think our workforce has to be ready for what's going to happen. Companies already built quantum repeaters. So I think that leadership is got a real challenge on its hands to move us into the next decade, next century, and make this work out well for humanity.
Well, I certainly hope so too. I really appreciate your feedback, and I would really like to have you back on another time if that's all right.
Absolutely.
That was a really great conversation. I appreciate your feedback. I'll be happy to continue that another time, and we can carry on to the next level of discussion on this.
That works. Just let me know.
Sounds good.
Will do.
Sounds terrific.
Well, thanks again. We're going to sign off, and thank you for listening. And gentlemen, thank you for being on the show. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.